Welcome to the Holding All the Cards podcast. My name's Daniel. I go by Kiramode on the forums, and today I'm going to do a deck spotlight on not a particular deck, but more of a particular deck type and some information that I've gotten to start off with this current build and how I've changed it from here to other decks. So the deck type is Jarrett on the forums called it. Um, one was called The Promise of Loyalty, and the other one's called what was it? I don't know. Something about some pun with the Superlaser and the Emperor's Promise. Uh, the idea here being the deck type is primarily revolving around Mission Palpatine and the things that you can do with him. So the two key cards are Palpatine and Lure of the Dark Side, and namely trying to trigger these guys easily to steal your opponent's dudes. So you want to get as many super lasers as possible. Um, when I first thought of this deck, this is the deck that I initially ran. And the idea behind it was I want my my cards that enable me to steal stuff. I want my super lasers. I want Tarkin, and from there, I just want cards that help me out. So in my version of the deck, I had Bach in here. And the reason I had Bach in there was I just felt like you're not always going to pick up Lure of the Dark Side to trigger your Super Laser. So you want just one more mission in the Dark Genocide to assist you in doing that. On top of that, you get Vader and you get Bach, who have targeted strike. So, they can go and lay out some guys. And then Council gives you card draw and resources. And then Imperial Bureaucracy lets you recur some cards between Sate and Endless Bureaucracy. My thinking when I built this deck was I want to get Palpatine out as fast as I reasonably can while still being able to trigger Vader's objective most of the time. So I felt I needed the resources, and that's why I went double Council. And I mean, with this deck, you got 2 resources with Council, 2 with Tarkin, 2 with Vader, so that puts you at 6, plus 3 advisors between Council and Imperial Bureaucracy. So I was thinking, okay, I got some resources here, and in case of emergency, you got 2 Tarkins to also up your resource count. And there was some nice interactions here. I think being able to recur cards with what's his face, Sate, is pretty good. When you can get like a turn 2 Palpatine and then turn 3 Super Laser, that's what kind of blows games wide open. And also, there are some games where you'll flop mono red and you get Dark Lord of the Sith early, and you can just hold people back long enough, because Vader's pod is really important for this deck, because what you don't want is you don't want to just lose in the first couple turns. So between Visage of the Dark Lord and Telekinetic Strike, you have ways to just slow them down, right? Like, you don't need to hold them off forever. You just need to slow opponents down for a couple turns, so that way you can get your Palpatine, Lure of the Dark Side, Dark Genocide, Super Laser combo set up. Also, between Council and Imperial Bureaucracy, you get increased edge hands. So if you drop early tactics like a Sate, a Tarkin, a Advisor, or something, you can, again, just hold them off. You don't need to hold them off forever. You just got to hold them off long enough to get your board set up. And then the card draw is important so you can get your combo pieces in place. Now, the problem I had with this deck is that too many guys can just get ran over. So you're never going to be able to play Palpatine or Vader turn 1, which means your typical turn 1 openings, you're looking at a lot of Tarkin, a lot of Bach, a lot of advisors. Maybe you'll get like one of these Royal Guards. Sometimes you're forced to play these dudes, which are pretty terrible. And then you have to play more Sate Pestage than you'd really want to out of the gate, just to hold them off. And so the problem is these dudes here don't have tactics. So if an opponent has guys that they don't really care about edge, they're just going to swing through. And then these guys, their health is too low. along with him. So you just have these situations where if you can win edge, you can typically survive a turn. But if an opponent has a seeds, or they win edge, or they have a protection, or they have some way to unfocus their guy after a tactics, it just creates a situation where you're going to get absolutely ran over in some situations. Or sometimes an opponent's just going to have Owen's objective, and if they have 3 extra cards, that negates Imperial Bureaucracy, or it's more than Council can give you out of the gate. So I didn't like how a lot of games I'd know after like turn 1 that I've lost. Because now the deck does have some comeback potential. So if this setup here, these dudes, if they can hold off guys for like a turn, an opponent can build a really intimidating board. But if like turn 2, turn 3, you're dropping your lure, you're dropping your Palppatine, and then either Tarkin plus Blast coming from either Vader or Bach, or a Superlaser allows you to steal one of their guys, you can turn the table and just develop your board past the point where they can develop their board. And if you steal like a Luke Skywalker, or you steal like a speeder bike or something, you can put yourself in a situation where they can redraw their unit and then simply not be able to play them because they're on your side of the table. So what I ended up doing is I ran this at a tournament, and I got really frustrated with how the deck would just get ran over. I don't like feeling helpless in that sense. So I went to the forums, and I saw what other people were trying with these sorts of deck types. And then there was a different deck type that it looks like other people like playing, which is, it has some ideas similar here, but are totally different. The main deck type that people have tried is they kind of fire Council. A lot of people don't use Bureaucracy, and a lot of people don't use Merciless Plans. Although I do see a good number of lists that still have at least one Vader. So they go with Yularen. Now the reason I didn't have Yularen in my earlier list was I wanted to have Dark Lord of the Sith active, and Yularen doesn't totally allow for that. So a lot of other lists, they'll go to Yularen, and they'll go to encounter at Stygian Prime. They'll even fire Tarkin. So it's just a completely different type of deck. So your core of the deck is you go to Palpatine, to Yularen, to encounter a Stygian Prime, and then from there you kind of toolbox it. So they'll go like 1 Mara to improve your objective flops, and then they'll go 1 or 2 Dark Lords. Some people might throw like a Sate in there, and then maybe 1 Tarkin. So I experimented with a couple of these decks, and the deck that I ultimately settled on that I felt was the strongest of these was, you don't play these two. You run 1 Mara, 1 Dark Lord, another Dark Lord, sorry, and then you do run Tarkin. So this was the deck that was totally different, but still had a lot of the same flavor. But the goals of the deck were definitely different. So whereas in the previous deck, your 2 most important cards were easily Lure of the Dark Side and Emperor Palpatine. In this deck, Lure of the Dark Side is still really good. Palpatine is mostly an edge card. If you have a chance to play him, you play him. But like in the other deck, you play Palpatine basically anytime you have 6 resources. In this deck, you play Palpatine if you have the ability to immediately trigger his reaction. So if like there's an objective that has like 2 or 3 health left, and you can send Palpatine and immediately attack and blow up the objective and steal a guy, then you play him. But otherwise, you don't, because his stats are just too weak as a defender, and he's just not worth the 6 mana that it costs to get him out there. This deck, it really is more about the objectives. So what you want is, you either want like Dark Lord in a mono red setup, or you want Enforced Loyalty with sort of backup objectives. So if you have like Emperor's Promise and Enforced Loyalty at the same time, that means your opponent's going to be taking minimum 1 damage somewhere, which is pretty important. And then Encounter at Stygian Prime allows you to lock down their board way more often than you'd think. And then you can sub out Encounter at Stygian Prime for Agent of the Emperor, which allows you to focus their guys during your force phase, because odds are, if you have Emperor's Promise and Enforced Loyalty, Agent of the Emperor is something that your opponent doesn't really care about. Now, in this setup, you actually have better openings. Like you have better units that you can actually use to build a real defensive front. Your main guy is the Inquisitor. The Inquisitor is a fantastic blocker because he allows you to cycle your hands similar to a Dark Precog. So you can build up good edge hands with him. He has all black icons. He's elite. He is your ideal turn 1 play. Alongside him, for good turn 1 plays, you definitely want to get your mouse droids out there. So when you can get like early mouse droid plus early Inquisitor, it allows you to draw into your answers, which means that even though you have only one Tarkin and only one Superlaser, you're probably going to draw into them because you have the card draw set up here, and this is a recurring engine, right? You can just keep doing it every single turn. What I also noticed is that these kind of function better in this deck as late game cards, so you only want one of them anyways, and they do the same thing. The other reason that the card draw is nice is that I know from personal experience in playing Navy that Imperial Fist and Yularen, the toughest part about playing them is you're not always going to have the ability to go trigger their trigger them at the right time, or when you do need them, you don't have them. Having a mouse droid and the Inquisitor makes it more likely that you're going to be able to draw into these guys exactly when you need them. On top of that, you have a couple other nice cards. Bones of the Fallen Master is about as good as it gets for your opening play. If you can have Bones of the Fallen Master and Enforced Loyalty out on turn 1, it puts an incredible amount of pressure on the light side player to get attacks in, and they have to keep getting attacks in. And then if you have Emperor's Promise, it makes it even harder for light side to not take damage out. For these reasons, Tarkin's actually better than a Superlaser in this deck because you're dealing all these little dink and dunk damages that if you can get like 1 or 2 damage on each of the objectives, a Fist blows it up, Yularen blows it up, or Tarkin comes in and then you send like a dink attack with like Yularen or whoever to just take it out. And then if you remember earlier I said that the reason I didn't like the other deck was I didn't like how much it got ran over. This deck, by having 2 Inquisitors, helps you with not getting ran over, but you also got Mara Jade too, which people forget how good she is just as a defender, and she's a really good person to play out of the gate, so that way you can build your defensive front. And then you have more force-sensitive guys in this deck, so it allows you to resource ramp a little bit better with Vader's enhancement. So between Inquisitor, Mara Jade, and Vader, you can pretty quickly build up a pretty solid defensive front. And then you also have Mythal in the deck, who he's not a terrible defender, so you just have more guys that can actually play defense, won't allow you to get ran over, and your offense is different. So whereas the other deck was really explosive with your Superlasers and Palppatine, this deck more just tries to nickel and dime an opponent until you can get to the place where you can just wipe them clean on all their objectives. I've also found with this deck, it's a little bit easier to get Lure of the Dark Side to trigger. And the reason I find it easier to get it to trigger is when you play Lure of the Dark Side in the other deck, you basically had to deal the 5 damage in one shot or Superlaser. In this deck, let's say I play Lure of the Dark Side either turn 1 or turn 2, which is pretty reasonable. And then I have either Emperor's Promise or I have Enforced Loyalty. And then the last possible card that I could have would be like Bones of the Fallen Master. I have one of these 3 cards that allow me to deal incidental damage to Lure of the Dark Side. When you have that setup, getting 1 or 2 damage to just sit on Lure of the Dark Side is really easy, which means it's always going to be, in most games, in striking distance for Vader to just come in and clean off the objective, which that's a pretty powerful move. If like you play Vader, blow up the objective, kill a guy, steal another guy. It also puts it within pretty reasonable range for you, Lauren, to come in, move 2 damage from one of my objectives over to this objective, and then swing in himself to finish it off and steal a guy. Then you also can Imperial Fist it, which is nice. And that's why it's also good to have Tarkin. You just get one more unique Navy unit. And as I said earlier with both Inquisitor and the Mouse Droid, getting that card draw helps you get all these combo pieces in place. Now, as with any deck, you got to kind of talk about what the weaknesses are. And one of the weaknesses I see with this deck is this deck sometimes deploys too many cards. There's going to be turns where you're going to play 5 or 6 cards at the same, or sorry, 4 cards or so that you play in one turn. And the problem with playing that many cards is you're going to have really, really terrible edge hands. So while you may have better units to defend with, you have less cards to work with. Now, that's really only a problem in the first. It's probably not a problem turn 1, but it is definitely a problem mid-game once you get your resource set up and you start deploying a bunch of cards. Because the thing about Imperial Fist is, in this deck, it's probably better as an offensive card than a defensive card, mainly because defensively it could get twisted out, or they can send attacks in a way where they can avoid the Fist. But what I have noticed about Fist is when Lure of the Dark Side has only 2 damage capacity left, that's when Imperial Fist is a better defensive card. When Lure of the Dark Side has like 1 or 2 damage on it, you really want to Fist on your turn and then send guys to finish it off. But if you can get Lure of the Dark Side with a little bit of damage and then still have one of your Navy officers to sit back and defend it, Imperial Fist for the surprise kill on the Lure of the Dark Side, and then you steal one of their attackers. That's a pretty powerful move that you can do to defend. But like I said, you typically use it as an offensive card, and when you use it as an offensive card, that's even less cards that you have in your hand to protect yourself with. Whereas the other deck had better edge hand, this one has better units. I mean, every deck has its pros and its cons. But what I do like about this deck is that it feels more consistent. It feels like with this deck, the goal is, okay, you're going to have good objective flops. So it's kind of like Navy in the sense where if your objective flop is just about always going to be pretty good, you can say, okay, I can have a good objective flop. My cards that I play on the table don't need to be great, right? I don't need to have the nuts every time. I just need to have serviceable hands that I can push out with. I've also tried this deck where I've taken out Tarkin and replaced them with Mara to make sure that I always have good flops. Because the one thing I noticed with this deck is that just about every single bad flop that this deck has with objectives all involve the ultimate power. It's not good. Like it doesn't work in any of your flops. But if you swap this out with Mara's objective, every single one of your flops is either going to be mono red, so you can trigger Dark Lord of the Sith, or it's going to have 2 enforced loyalties, which if you have like 2 enforced loyalties and then any other objective, that's a pretty good flop to work with, especially if you can get an early Bones of the Fallen Master out there too. But what I did notice is if you swap it out, you lose upside, right? So you get an extra defender and that you get 2 Maras and you get better objective flops. But what you lose is you lose like the late game Tarkin to just end the game, or the late game Superlaser to get some combos to go off. And that's what bugged me. You also lose a control room, which this is where it goes consistency versus upside. 1-for-1 resources are generally better early game, but the 2-for-2s are better if you want to get a Palppatine out, right? Like if you still want to get your turn 2 Palppatine, the best way to do that is you play a control room and then only single tap it, and then maybe play like a Chud plus like a Weenie, right? So maybe like your turn 1 will be something like control room plus Tarkin, or control room plus an officer and like a protector. I'm trying to find one of these fools. Like something like that. Or maybe you play like Mythal plus a scrub. Or maybe you play the little dude that comes with the Inquisitor. Right? But you can do it in a way where you can you can have your setup so you can get your turn 2 Palppatine. But you don't really always want a turn 2 Palppatine, so I thought if you swap it, it would work. But that's just another deck idea if you want to try it out. So if you're looking for another dark side deck or just want to try different ideas outside of your standard mono Sith, mono Scum, or mono Navy, this is a pretty interesting deck type. This one I believe is called the Promise of Loyalty. I think it's really good. I think it's more consistent than you think it'd be, and the objectives do a lot of the work. You rely a lot on these objectives putting in enough work so that way your command deck doesn't need to do everything. Your command deck can be good enough, and if your command deck actually curves out really good, if you go like turn 1 Inquisitor, turn 2 Vader, that's when this deck just goes to a whole nother level of effectiveness, when you're able to just get everything clicking perfectly. So this has been this episode of Holding All the Cards. Hope you like it, and see you next time.